They expected chains, not kindness. When German soldiers, fresh from the battlefields of North Africa and Normandy, were captured and shipped across the Atlantic, they braced for punishment. In their minds, America was the land of the enemy, the place where vengeance awaited. Yet when the prison gates swung open, what they found wasn't hatred. It was humanity. Behind the barbed wire, there was laughter over baseball games, the smell of fresh cornbread drifting from camp kitchens, and farmers who offered lemonade instead of scorn. Enemies became workers, workers became neighbors, and neighbors, unthinkably, became friends. Decades later, letters would still cross oceans between those who had once stood on opposite sides of war. This is the forgotten story of how compassion bloomed in the most unlikely soil, a story that challenges everything we think we know about enemies, forgiveness, and the quiet strength of ordinary people. If stories like this make you believe that humanity can still surprise us, hit like, tap subscribe, and share this video with someone who loves real-life history that feels stranger than fiction. Your support helps these forgotten voices be heard. And trust me, you'll want to stay for how this one unfolds. The sea groaned under gray skies as thousands of captured German soldiers were herded onto Liberty ships bound for a place they could barely imagine. America, the enemy, the myth, waded across the restless Atlantic. They came with heads shaved by dust and defeat, uniforms torn by sand and smoke. For many, surrender felt like erasing their very names. The ocean voyage stretched endlessly, filled with silence, suspicion, and dread. Rumors spread through the ranks like whispers through fog. They had been told Americans shot prisoners, starved them, worked them to death. Each wave slapping against the hull sounded like a warning of what awaited. But when land finally appeared, a faint line of green through the mist, it wasn't the battlefield they'd envisioned. It was quiet, even beautiful. Seagulls wheeled overhead, and somewhere faintly a harmonica played. For the first time in years, they weren't soldiers. They were simply men. Men with no orders, no weapons, only the gnawing uncertainty of what came next in this strange new world. As the ships docked at East Coast ports, the prisoners stepped onto American soil under heavy guard. Cameras clicked. Locals stared, curiosity and unease mingling like smoke and sunlight. The war had arrived home. Convoys of buses and trains carried them inland, deep into America's heartland. Through windows, they saw forests, fields, and towns untouched by bombs. It was almost insulting how peaceful everything looked after years of ruin. Some of them pressed faces to the glass, stunned by the abundance. Grocery stores, full barns, children laughing in schoolyards. It was a prosperity they hadn't seen since before Hitler's rise. They expected hostility, maybe even violence. Instead, they were met with rules, paperwork, and efficiency, cold but not cruel. America, it seemed, didn't hate them. It barely noticed them. In the Midwest, the first camps appeared like small cities of barbed wire, rows of wooden barracks, guard towers, and flags snapping in the wind. This would be their world now, contained, controlled, and oddly civilized. Many braced for punishment, but instead were handed blankets, soap, and meals that stunned them, bread with butter, hot coffee, even meat. For soldiers who'd eaten weeds in Italy, it felt unreal. Inside the camps, the first night was sleepless. The distant hum of American trains replaced the front's artillery thunder. Some stared at ceilings, whispering prayers. Others just lay there wondering why kindness hurt more than cruelty. Letters to families were allowed, written neatly on government forms. "I am alive," they scribbled, unsure what else to say. How could they explain that captivity felt gentler than freedom had for years? The guards, mostly young Americans, treated them with polite indifference. Orders were barked, yes, but without venom. Some even offered cigarettes. It was confusing. Weren't these supposed to be monsters on both sides? Days turned into a rhythm. Roll call, work assignments, meals, and the slow dawning realization that they were safe. Safe, but not free. That paradox sat heavy in every heart behind the wire. And still, beneath the order and calm, an ache lingered. They thought of home, of mothers knitting in ruins, of cities burning under Allied bombs. Safety, it turned out, carried its own kind of guilt. At night, the air filled with murmured songs, quiet German hymns blending with the creak of the wooden bunks. Even the guards sometimes stopped to listen, the sound of enemies remembering they were human. America hadn't planned to show mercy. It had simply followed its rules. But mercy happened anyway. In the warmth of food, the fairness of routine, and the simple decency of men doing their duty without hate. By dawn, a strange peace had settled. Beyond the wire, fields shimmered under morning dew. Inside, weary soldiers stood at attention, breathing in the scent of unfamiliar soil. Their war was over. Something else was beginning. Morning broke the same way every day, with the sharp whistle of roll call slicing through the camp air. Boots scuffed gravel. Names were counted, shouted, repeated. Order imposed on men who'd lived too long in chaos. The camps, sprawling grids of barracks and fences, became tiny worlds of repetition. Breakfast at dawn, work details by mid-morning, drills of routine meant to dull the edges of thought and memory. Inside each wooden barrack, soldiers carved small corners of comfort, photographs taped beside bunks, makeshift curtains hung from strings, little shelves whittled from scrap wood. It wasn't home, but it was something that belonged to them. Meals astonished everyone. Even rationed, the food was hearty. Stew, bread, sometimes eggs or fruit. Many wrote home admitting they ate better in America than their families did in bombed-out German towns. Some guards watched with amusement as prisoners polished their boots and folded uniforms that no longer mattered. Pride, it seemed, survived even behind wire. Dignity was a small rebellion no one could confiscate. Sports became salvation. Soccer fields were scratched into open ground, balls patched from rags, goals built from scrap lumber. When matches began, shouts and laughter echoed across the camp like echoes of life before war. Even the guards lingered near the fence to watch. For a few hours, enemies became athletes. Victories were celebrated, losses forgotten by sundown. The language of the game spoke louder than orders ever could. Education followed. American officials encouraged classes to keep minds occupied. English lessons, history, mathematics. Some prisoners discovered talents long buried beneath years of marching and orders. One became a painter, another a poet. At night, lamps flickered through the barracks as groups studied quietly. Words like freedom, future, and home took on fragile meanings, scribbled in notebooks beside lists of English verbs and American slang. Music, too, filled the emptiness. Prisoners formed orchestras from donated instruments, violins, clarinets, even an old piano shipped from a nearby church. The melodies floated over the wire, softening the distance between captor and captive. Guards sometimes paused their patrols, listening. For a few moments, duty slipped away, and what remained was something simpler. Men from opposite sides sharing the same quiet heartbeat of a song carried by wind. Daily life felt paradoxical. It was confinement, yet there was safety. The world beyond the fence burned and raged, while inside, time stood still, predictable, almost mercifully dull. For many, it was the first peace in years. Of course, not all found comfort. Some hardened officers clung to ideology, sneering at kindness, calling others weak for shaking hands with guards or smiling at Americans. Old loyalties fought new realities within every soul. There were whispers of tension, fistfights, sabotage, the occasional punishment. But those moments faded quickly under the sheer monotony of days. Hatred, it seemed, required too much energy to maintain indefinitely. Letters arrived through the Red Cross, precious fragments from a shattered homeland. Some cried silently as they read of missing brothers, ruined houses, hungry children. Paper carried more weight than any rifle ever had. Others responded by creating, painting murals, writing plays, carving wooden toys for the guards' children. Creativity became a form of survival, a reminder that they could still build rather than destroy. By late afternoon, the camp hummed with rhythm. Tools clanged, laughter mingled with orders, and the smell of supper drifted through the air. Beyond the wire, cornfields rippled golden in the setting sun. As night fell, men lay in their bunks, staring at ceilings of rough timber, listening to the crickets beyond the fence. They were prisoners, but alive, fed, learning, dreaming again. And somehow, that was enough. When the trucks first rolled beyond the wire, the prisoners could hardly believe the gates were opening for them. Not to freedom, but to fields stretching wide beneath the same American sky. Labor shortages had emptied the countryside. With sons overseas and harvests in jeopardy, the government's answer was simple. Use the men already here, even if they'd worn the wrong uniform a few months earlier. At first, the prisoners feared a trap. They expected insults, stones, maybe worse. Instead, they were met by farmers who just needed hands to work the land and eyes to judge the weather. The early mornings were crisp with dew, the air smelling of earth and diesel. Germans, once trained to destroy, now bent over rows of cotton, corn, and beans. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. Some locals watched warily from porches, arms folded. Others, exhausted by endless seasons, shrugged. Work was work. If these men could save the crop, the past could stay silent for a while. A few words bridged the distance. Water, shovel, good. Laughter followed mispronunciations until gestures replaced language altogether. Sweat, rhythm, and shared effort built a vocabulary older than war or politics. Guards leaned on fence posts, rifles slung loosely, more observers than wardens. Escape wasn't on anyone's mind. Where would they run? Across half a continent that wasn't theirs. Freedom felt abstract compared to purpose. For the prisoners, work brought dignity back. The soil yielded to their hands. Muscles ached with honest fatigue instead of fear. Each bus ride back to camp smelled of sweat, sun, and quiet pride. Letters home changed tone. They wrote about tractors, about generous farmers, about meals eaten beneath oak trees. Between the lines, families could sense disbelief that America treated its enemies so humanely. There were awkward moments. One farmer cursed in English. A prisoner mistook it for praise. Another offered bread, only to realize later that sharing food with Nazis angered his neighbors. Compassion didn't always come easy. Still, habits formed. Women packed extra sandwiches, children waved as trucks passed, and the fear that once stiffened every exchange slowly melted into routine. Ordinary life has a way of taming suspicion. In the fields, laughter became common. Someone whistled a tune, another joined. By noon, entire crews worked in rhythm, the line between captive and employer blurring under the relentless summer sun. Evenings back in camp felt lighter. Men talked about the farms, the families, the food. The outside world had color again. The war, for a few hours, seemed like something happening elsewhere. Not everyone approved. Newspapers called the program dangerous, unpatriotic. Angry letters accused the army of coddling killers, but crops kept coming in, and outrage faded against the practical weight of full granaries. The farmers, meanwhile, found the Germans efficient, even grateful. Some requested the same crews again, saying they worked better than hired locals. Friendship was never the goal, but it crept in anyway. Occasionally, a storm or broken machine forced them to seek shelter together. Inside barns, they shared cigarettes and stories of families left behind. In those moments, humanity replaced history for a little while. By harvest's end, both sides had changed. The Americans saw men, not monsters. The Germans saw kindness, not propaganda. Behind the fences that night, the prisoners slept, knowing something unexpected had taken root. Underneath the vast American stars, the land itself seemed complicit in forgiveness. Wheat waved like an unspoken truce, and somewhere in the dark, the distant echo of laughter marked the fragile beginning of understanding. The first meetings between German prisoners and American townsfolk were tense and awkward, like actors uncertain of their lines. Eyes averted, words stumbled, and silence filled the spaces where suspicion still lived. Farmers barked short instructions, while prisoners nodded, eager not to offend. The rhythm of work replaced conversation. The sound of shovels and tractors spoke louder than words that neither side fully trusted. Children peered from behind fences, wide-eyed, whispering. Mothers warned them to keep their distance. The newspapers had called these men dangerous, yet they looked tired, young, almost like the brothers they missed overseas. Days stretched into weeks, and the tension thinned like morning fog. Curiosity replaced fear. Someone offered water. Another returned a smile. These small gestures carried the weight of something quietly revolutionary. A farmer's wife once brought sandwiches for her husband's crew, adding a few extra out of instinct. The Germans hesitated before taking them, uncertain if kindness could be real in enemy country. That moment changed everything. Gratitude bridged where language failed. The woman's children giggled as the men fumbled for English words, and soon, laughter replaced the wary silence that had once filled the fields. It wasn't just food that softened the line. Shared effort, shared exhaustion. They both spoke of survival. Under the same sun, sweat and dust erased nationality faster than any treaty ever could. One afternoon, a prisoner carved a small wooden bird for a farmer's daughter. It was delicate, precise, the work of patient hands. The child's delight melted a layer of fear no uniform could restore. Stories like that spread fast. Soon, other families brought small gifts: lemonade, pie, spare gloves. Suspicion, once rooted deep, began to bloom into an uneasy but genuine trust that felt stronger than logic. There were missteps, of course. A joke misunderstood, a word mistranslated. But each mistake became a lesson, a reminder that understanding doesn't grow from perfection. It grows from the courage to keep trying. Evenings brought quiet transformations. Farmers lingered a little longer before sending the prisoners back. They talked about weather, crops, or family. Simple talk, ordinary talk, yet sacred for what it dared to bridge. Some guards, too, found themselves caught between rules and empathy. They relaxed their stance, joined in laughter, and sometimes even helped translate. Humanity was proving more contagious than suspicion had ever been. Children ignored warnings and slipped close to the fields. They marveled at German songs drifting through the air. Wooden toys exchanged for apples, words swapped for smiles, the beginnings of peace whispered through play. A few townsfolk disapproved, whispering that friendliness was betrayal. But most, weary from years of fear, found solace in the ordinary miracle of decency. The war felt far away, smaller somehow. For the prisoners, these gestures were life-changing. They'd been told Americans were monsters. Instead, they found families, laughter, and a kindness that confused and humbled them more than victory ever could. At night, back behind the wire, they talked about the people they'd met, the food they'd tasted, the laughter they'd shared. It wasn't freedom, but it was the next best thing: belonging. By summer's end, the Germans had names: Hans, Karl, Dieter, the same ones locals began to say with warmth. Enemies had become workers, and workers had somehow become neighbors under the vast American sky. No speeches marked that transformation, no orders approved it. It simply happened quietly, one handshake at a time. Amid war's wreckage, humanity had decided, against all odds, to survive. By the time another summer rolled across the heartland, the fences no longer felt like walls. They stood, of course, but invisible lines had already been crossed in hearts and habits. Friendship was never announced, never declared. It grew quietly between shared tasks, jokes exchanged in broken English, and the easy rhythm of work that had become more human than hostile. Some evenings, guards let prisoners play music outside. Accordions, harmonicas, and borrowed guitars turned dusty lots into small festivals. Locals gathered beyond the wire, drawn by songs they didn't understand but somehow felt. There were concerts where German orchestras played Beethoven beneath the American flag. Applause erupted not for sides, but for beauty itself. For an instant, art made enemies irrelevant. Sports, too, became bridges. Soccer and baseball swapped spaces. Rules blurred. Laughter erupted at confused gestures. On those makeshift fields, uniforms faded into sweat-stained shirts, and the competition felt almost like communion. Christmas brought something unforgettable. Prisoners decorated small pine branches, carving stars from scrap tin. Locals left baked goods near the fence. The faint sound of silent night carried through the cold air, shared without translation. In one camp, a guard invited prisoners to his church's Christmas service. They entered timidly, expecting judgment. Instead, townsfolk offered handshakes, warm smiles, and the same hymns sung in two languages. Cultural exchange became daily life. The prisoners shared recipes, building sturdy loaves of bread that reminded them of home. In return, Americans taught them to make apple pie, a dessert now flavored with reconciliation. Even humor survived. Farmers teased their German crews about slow work. The prisoners fired back jokes about American coffee. Laughter echoed over fields that had once known only silence and suspicion. Letters crossed the wire, delivered secretly or approved officially. "Thank you for your kindness," one wrote. "I will never forget this land." Some farmers kept those letters folded in drawers for decades. Not all agreed with such closeness. Newspapers warned of fraternization, claiming compassion weakened patriotism. But locals knew the truth. War demanded hate, while survival demanded humanity. Most chose the latter without regret. The guards themselves softened. A rifle became lighter when trust grew heavier. Many shared cigarettes, stories, and photos of wives or sweethearts waiting far away. Loneliness blurred the uniform's meaning. Sometimes tragedy reminded everyone that war still raged. A telegram would arrive announcing a son lost overseas. A prisoner would bow his head beside his grieving guard, two men mourning different sides of the same loss. Moments like that carved deep memories. Friendship no longer felt treasonous. It felt necessary, a way to endure the unendurable. Compassion became the quiet rebellion against the machinery of war. In the workshops, prisoners carved gifts. Chess sets, toys, intricate boxes. These weren't trades for pity, they were offerings of gratitude. Many still sit on mantels across America, mute witnesses to impossible kindness. When the end of the war finally loomed, laughter carried a bittersweet note. Everyone knew the friendships born under barbed wire would soon be tested by oceans, politics, and time. Farewell came softly. Handshakes through fences, hurried translations of thanks, promises to write. No treaties were signed that day, but peace felt tangible, alive in the hearts of ordinary people. And when the trucks finally took the prisoners away, townsfolk waved from porches. Children cried. In the fading dust, the echo of friendship lingered, a fragile, luminous thing that had survived the shadow of war. When the news finally spread that the war was over, the camps fell into a strange silence. Victory for one side meant departure for the other, and no one felt entirely ready. Men who had spent years behind fences stood blinking in the sun, suddenly unsure of what freedom meant anymore. It had become a dream too big to hold and too bittersweet to celebrate. Trains waited at distant stations, engines sighing impatiently. Farmers came to see them off, faces weathered by work and memory. Some brought gifts, letters, photographs, or small boxes of food for the journey home. The goodbyes were awkward, wordless at first. Hands hesitated before shaking. Voices cracked over mismatched languages. Tears fell quietly, unashamed. Friendship had survived suspicion, and now it had to survive distance. Children waved carved toys in farewell, gifts once made from scraps of wood and time. Prisoners pressed small tokens through fences, a harmonica, a carving knife, a piece of the lives they'd shared. One farmer's wife tucked a note into a prisoner's jacket. "Thank you for showing us who you really are." Decades later, that note would still rest folded inside a family Bible. The convoys rumbled away, dust curling in the morning light. Behind them, fields shimmered gold, the same fields they had planted, harvested, and somehow turned into ground for forgiveness. In Germany, the men returned to ruins, cities hollowed by fire, families scattered, hunger biting. Yet many carried something fragile home, the belief that kindness could outlive propaganda and outlast war. Letters began to cross the ocean, scribbled on thin paper, written in careful English or shaky German. They spoke of harvests, marriages, and babies born under peacetime skies. For some, those letters never stopped. Decades later, gray-haired farmers and former prisoners would meet again, handshakes turning into embraces, laughter replacing the disbelief of those who watched history soften before their eyes. Reunions made headlines in local papers. German POW returns to visit family who once hired him. The photos showed smiles lined by time, proof that forgiveness isn't a theory. It's a life's work. Old men stood beside barns that hadn't changed, pointing to the places where their friendship had begun. "Here," one would say, tapping his cane, "this is where I stopped being afraid." Some families visited Germany in return, welcomed with open arms, tables full of food, and stories retold in 2 languages. War had divided continents, but memory built bridges far stronger than borders. Historians later called it an anomaly, proof of humane policy or luck. But those who lived it knew better. It wasn't policy, it was people, ordinary souls who chose compassion when cruelty was expected. The fences eventually came down. Grass grew over the campsites, but echoes remained, the laughter of games, the faint music of harmonicas, the hum of tractors driven by men once called enemies. In museums and family attics, mementos still whisper their story, a wooden toy, a faded photograph, a letter creased with decades of touch. Small things, holding the weight of impossible forgiveness. The story of those POWs and their American neighbors endures because it defied war's logic. It reminds us that humanity, when tested, can still surprise itself with mercy. And so, beneath the vast skies they once worked under, time continues its quiet harvest. Of friendship, of memory, of grace born from war's ashes. The long goodbye, it seems, never truly ended.